Today's disordered personality is a... Oh, how do I set him up? He's tall. He's dark in appearance and demeanor.
Well-renowned.
A melancholy poet of tragic... I'm done. Abraham Lincoln.
You could have opened it up with quite possibly the best president of the United States of America.
Well, that would have meant saying something relevant, normal, and that made sense. Yes, Abraham Lincoln considered... I might throw my bro G-Dub, George Washington, into that conversation, but I'll allow one of the top two. Speaking of disordered personalities, second episode I'll review again. It's someone from history, in this case Lincoln, or from the present, who has or would have been, had they lived today, been diagnosed with a mental illness. So, Abraham Lincoln, born February 12th, 1809. We're going to set the stage, the time period. This is right around the War of 1812, the United States v. the UK, United Kingdom, Great Britain. The U.S. kind of sees this as a war in its own right that has to do with the U.S. from the point of view of the U.S., as things tend to be in this country.
Correct.
Who knows why? But Europe views it as kind of more of a small, not that important part of the Napoleonic Wars. So for the UK, if you're going through the British educational system, you're not devoting much time to the War of 1812. In the United States, it's viewed as the United States won. In Canada, it's viewed as Canada won. So Abraham Lincoln, being born in 1809, born into the period where for the first time, although America is already an independent country, the term being thrown around is American nationalism. People are proud to be an American. Last week's disordered personality, Ludwig von Beethoven, at this time he was 39 years old. So contemporaries, Abraham Lincoln and Beethoven a bit older. They wouldn't have hung out.
Or they could have.
Well, maybe Lincoln was no. Baby.
They wouldn't have hung out at all.
I don't know how to say baby in German, but whatever that is, that's what Beethoven would have said when he saw young Abe.
Oh, look at that baby.
Well, that's not German, though.
No, that's actually...
I don't know what the word is, but I'm sure it's terrifying.
Babe.
Phonetically. Anyway, May 1809, we're sticking with Beethoven here for a second. The forces of Napoleon are bombarding Vienna, where Beethoven is, passing the time. Very worried that the noise would destroy what remained of his hearing, Beethoven hid in the basement of his brother's house, covering his ears with pillows. This is a quote from probably not a reliable internet source, but it's a cool little anecdote. So anyway, Lincoln, born as Beethoven, is hiding in his brother's basement, covering his ears with pillows. American nationalism, proud to be an American. This is the world of the young babe, Abraham Lincoln, Kentucky, 1809.
So moving on to his childhood.
1814, this is still part of the War of 1812. That's about the time. So the U.S. and the British come to terms in England, the Treaty of Ghent, G-H-E-N-T, pronunciation?
Ghent.
Are you guessing?
I'm guessing.
I think you guessed right. I don't know. Treaty of Ghent. But this is a time where this news has to then get back to the United States. It takes 6 weeks. In the meantime, even though the war is technically over, the British invade New Orleans. Andrew Jackson, waiting, massacres them.
Bloodbath.
In 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans, and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming.
This is part of the rise of American nationalism. That song you just heard, a very moving, sonic poem.
I can't.
The treaty was established. The British had wanted and were backing an independent Indian buffer state in the continental U.S. They wanted the natives to be their own country, and the U.S. said, no. And the British were like, okay, fine.
Fine, no.
So they abandoned the natives and they retreated into what is now Canada. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the Americans, us, our ancestors, did try to conquer Canada, failed. So Canada feels as though they won the War of 1812. The United States did, though, defeat the UK, Great Britain, so we also feel as we won the War of 1812, even though we lost to the Canadians. Anyway, Andrew Jackson stomps the British, becomes the man. 1814, Lincoln is 5 years old. This was a period of significant political conflict in the United States. The two main political parties, party number one, in no particular order, the Federalist Party. This is in the Northeast United States. They want a strong central government, and they have close ties to Britain still. The other group, the Democratic-Republican Party, interesting. They were centered in the South and West. They wanted to preserve slavery, and they wanted a small government. So when the War of 1812 happens, the Federalists kind of don't want to participate. That makes them look bad, and after the U.S. wins, that party disintegrates. 1815, the British leave the continental U.S. The Native Americans, their buffer state that was sponsored by Britain, now abandoned, they sign treaties. They get pretty screwed over, and I mean badly.
I would say so.
Surge of American nationalism with Andrew Jackson, the rise of two young nations, the United States of America and Canada, eh? Canada somewhere along the way just kept it chill. I like Canada.
I do like Canada. They're,
As if it's like one coherent, like homogenous thing. You go, oh yeah, Canada, yeah.
Yeah, I feel pretty good about it.
Lincoln, 6 years old. America has its identity. For the first time, the U.S. has a brand. It's marketable and it's freedom. In the immortal words of Mel Gibson in Braveheart. Hold on, let me correct myself. In the immortal word of Mel Gibson in Braveheart. But I digress. Back to Lincoln, our disordered personality. He was born in a one-room log cabin on Sinking Spring Farm in Hardin County, Kentucky. His grandfather was Captain Abraham Lincoln. He had the same name as his grandfather.
Relatable to Beethoven?
Our last week's DP, disordered personality, also had the same name as his grandfather. What's going on here? Let's move forward. Perhaps we'll uncover the cause.
Conspiracy?
His grandfather, Captain Abraham Lincoln, was killed in an Indian raid in 1786. Lincoln's father, Tom Lincoln, at the time 6 years old himself, witnessed this. I can't really relate to that, but I'm sure it was disturbing.
Disturbing for the young man, influential for the rest of his life.
For all parties involved. No one was a winner in that Indian raid. Thomas Lincoln, left on his own in the frontier of Kentucky at 6 years old, worked odd jobs to establish himself. And you know what? Let's be Socratic. Did he establish himself?
I would say so.
Yes, he did. Yeah, this is objectively yes.
He owned land?
He acquired at one point up to 816.5 acres of farmland, only to lose all but 200. This is where it starts to get a bit twisted, in legal land title disputes. So this was a time when, I think the law is a bit convoluted, the modern American law. I ain't passed the bar, but I know a little bit. Enough you won't illegally search my
Can we say
Jay-Z said it, so why not?
We're not Jay-Z.
He's a cultural icon.
We'll do him another
He's a
day.
positive male role model.
He cheated on Bae.
Is that true?
I don't know.
I don't really understand Lemonade.
Okay, you want to know why it's called Lemonade?
When life gives you Jay-Z and he cheats on you, make an album called Lemonade?
Exactly. How dumb is that? Or is she being ironic? I digress.
I'm rolling with this digression. If you were a mega famous female pop star with the support of all the single ladies, tens and if not hundreds of $1 million in the bank, people falling to their knees, kissing your feet. I'm assuming this is what Beyonce's life is like. Your equally famous and powerful husband cheats on you. Let's take a step back. How mad are you?
I'm so mad. You're right. I mean, I'm not saying the album shouldn't have been made. She has every right to make that album. She should have made that album, but let's call it something other than Lemonade.
But that's...
Just say it.
But I don't think... See, because when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade.
That's exactly why.
No,
Why
I
can't
don't
you-
think you're getting it.
I get it. How can I not get it?
Because you're not appropriately astounded by the genius of the word smithery.
Okay. I'll give it to Bay. Queen Bay.
Abraham Lincoln. His father acquired 816.5 acres of land, lost it in legal battles. He's like, no, that's dumb. I'm bouncing out of Kentucky. He moves to Indiana in 1816, sold his remaining 200 acres. His parents, Lincoln's parents, they were members of the Separate Baptist Church. The word here, the key word for the Separate Baptist Church, restrictive, okay? They are against alcohol, dancing, and slavery.
I love dancing.
And any combination of the three.
Rock and roll is not allowed.
1818, Abraham's mother Nancy dies of the highly technically named milk sickness. As we talked about with Beethoven last time, medicine in the early 1800s had room for improvement. Nancy, his mother, dies. I'm not, I feel bad about laughing. See, someone once said comedy is tragedy plus time.
Absolutely.
And I think about, okay, so someone close to me dies of some, our milk sickness is kind of what we say now, cancer. We don't know how to stop it. We like to pretend like we have this advanced medicinal treatment, and I'm sitting here laughing at milk sickness that she died of this and how stupid that is. But people are, this is morbid, but people die of our modern stupidly named diseases we don't understand. And in, what is this, 1818? So in 2216, right?
Mm-hmm. Cancer is going to be laughable.
Some young man will be laughing over the very words I'm saying right now. My infinite ignorance and egocentrism.
You're really, really self-deprecating.
1818, his mother Nancy dies of milk sickness, leaving his 11-year-old sister Sarah, he's 9 at the time, she's in charge of the household. However you feel about gender roles, doesn't really matter in 1818. You're an 11-year-old girl and your mother dies and you're the oldest.
Someone steps up to the plate.
You step up to the plate. If we remember with Beethoven as well, what was he, 17 when his mother died and he stayed for 5 years?
Caring for his brothers?
For his 2 younger brothers. It's kind of encouraging in a weird way. Now that I've kind of mocked the level of medicine, but the level of family commitment, I guess, or just responsibility. I don't think, what's her name, Sarah, if we could go back and talk to her, would have necessarily even thought that she did anything out of the ordinary.
Right.
Nor Beethoven, you know what I mean?
Right. Somebody your age saying.
It's like all of her friends their moms all probably died too, and
yeah.
They, you know what I mean? And again, this may seem unimportant or whatever, but I like to put myself in not how we look at it looking back, but what it was like for them. So as impressive as that is for this 11-year-old girl with a younger brother, this is just how it was.
Right.
Right. So 1819, his father, Thomas, marries the widow Sally Johnston, with whom Lincoln becomes very, very close. And if accounts are correct, he referred to her as mother, his stepmom.
Aww.
Yeah, so again, is fill in the blanks however you will. We can't be sure, but Sally Johnston comes in here a year later, 11-year-old girl running the house, and shortly thereafter the kids, or at least Lincoln, calling her mother. So she obviously was a interesting, significant person.
Oh, it's like that movie Stepmom with Susan Sarandon, Julia Roberts. It's exactly like that.
I don't watch Julia Roberts movies because I'm afraid her mouth will consume my soul. She has a huge mouth.
Weird nose.
Have you ever seen Jaws? I can't visually distinguish it from Julia Roberts. Speaking of Abraham Lincoln, his teenage years. I want to go back here for a second. Well, this is roughly his teenage years. As a youth, young Abe, what was he like? He was considered lazy. He disliked hard labor. Now, this is a direct quote. The citation we'll put in the information on the episode. Considered lazy for his, quote, reading, scribbling, writing, ciphering, writing poetry, etc. So he wrote poetry, ciphers. He was a cryptographer. I think he might have started Cicada 3301. Do you know what that is?
What is that? Tell me.
It's a secret.
No.
Hush your mouth. We'll go back to it. We'll have time for... We almost went down a conspiracy tangent with Beethoven and the Illuminati.
Yeah, we did.
I can't tell you this stuff yet.
We'll return.
People are...
You'll let me in?
I've made oaths.
I don't believe you.
Blood in, blood out.
Speaking of Lincoln.
Teenage years, 1820s. He kind of became responsible, right? Oh, I do want to say here, again, this is like, I apologize, but he loved to read his favorite books because he was recent enough that we can actually know this stuff. This is cool. Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe.
A well-read young man.
Right, so if you read, some of those fables, or you go read Robinson Crusoe, picture yourself, Abraham Lincoln read that book. You're reading the same book Abraham Lincoln read. I mean, not literally the same book.
It's not the same copy.
It's probably a few generations down the publication line.
So stop saying that.
Well, I mean, I know.
I get it.
I know what you're getting at here, but yeah, you don't think that's interesting? You don't feel a connection?
In his shoes, I don't necessarily feel connected.
Not in a real way, but in...
What I most take from it is that more than likely that influenced his side of adventure, which...
Well, I'm not so much... I agree, but I'm not so much interested by the fact that it's Robinson Crusoe as it is the fact that I can pick up a book that, in the most general sense, right, Abraham Lincoln, who we kind of, at least is considered like a legend, he was a regular teenage kid, and he at one point was sitting there reading that book. So if you read that book, or Aesop's Fables, like, I like mathematical logic. You are both in the set of people who have read that book. So you have that in common, a connection with Abraham Lincoln.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. I see where you've gone.
The genealogy of categorical logic. I just made all those words up. I didn't make the words up. I'm done. He became responsible in his teenage years. He did chores. He gave all his money he earned to his father. This was customary. This was not his father being a jerk. Okay, everybody, again, did this. So he did what was expected of him. He stepped up. He became known for his axe skills. That is not to say he was a freak virtuoso guitarist, all right? He was chopping down real trees with a real axe. He was not melting faces with Megadeth riffs.
Some may say a professional lumberjack, if there's such a thing.
He's actually, people have seen pictures of Lincoln. I think mostly his face. It looks like it was processed through a leather tanning plant. I don't mean that in a mean way, but he's a unique-looking person. In his youth, he was tall, athletic, and had a reputation as being kind of a tough guy, actually, believe it or not.
Actually, can I interject here that he was tall and lanky and mildly, maybe not noticeably deformed, but he did have, suspected to have Marfan syndrome, pronunciation.
I don't know what that is.
It's a disease of the bones where their fingers and legs, they're just generally tall and expansive. I don't know. I don't think it affected him physically as an ailment.
He just kind of had it's like a bone disease?
It's like a bone
he was
deformation.
A kind of knobby, angular,
right,
gangly guy, right?
Super gangly.
You're saying that was actually a condition.
Right. And they didn't have it.
Say the name of the disease one more time.
Marfan syndrome.
Okay.
Yeah.
Marfan.
Marzipan?
I was thinking that too.
Marfan syndrome.
So that's interesting. So he had a physical deformity, if you want to call it that, disease. So despite this, like you alluded to, it didn't affect him. Apparently, here's the anecdote of where Abe Lincoln where he graduated from the School of Hard Knocks. He got in a, quote, competitive wrestling match with this leader of this local wrestling gang, just ruffians, I think is the word on Wikipedia.
I like that.
And I don't know, it didn't really say if he won or not, but it did say afterward that he was legit. He had street cred. He would walk around with his axe and be like, "Who wants some of Abe?" And people were like, "No, thank you."
And all the girls were fawning. "Oh, Abe."
Ran in terror. Is that synonymous for fawning?
Get away from the tall man with the axe.
Just can you imagine this slightly bony, deformed giant with teenage axe wrestling beast just walking around, writing poetry and stuff? This is a fictional character. 1830. 21?
Born
Do you watch
18
Vine? You ever seen that Vine? What's 9 plus 10? 21?
No, I've never seen that.
What's 9 plus 10?
21?
You stupid.
Okay, so what? He's born in 1809, right? So 1830. Lincoln is now 21 years old.
21?
Mathematician.
His family moves to Illinois. I almost said Illinois. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
His family moves, fearing another outbreak of the dreaded milk sickness. I probably should look I don't know what that is. Do you know what that is?
Is it she actually drank bad milk?
I hope not. I mean,
Is that
maybe.
mad cow disease? Man, I don't even know a lot about mad cow disease.
1831, 22 years old. Lincoln strikes out on his own as a 22-year-old, which now that I think about it, Beethoven moving home at 17 and then leaving 5 years later would have made him 22. What's going on here? There's a pattern.
I mean, young men striving out on their own.
That's about the age you graduate college.
Yeah, striving out on your own.
He gets hired to take a flatboat of goods on down the Mississippi to New Orleans.
On down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico.
This is again 1831. You know what that reminds me of? He pretty much literally lives the story of Huckleberry Finn. Now that Mark Twain novel I wrote down here was written in 1876. This is 1831, 50 years before the novel. Abe Lincoln lives it. He goes down the Mississippi
On down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico.
to New Orleans. He sees slavery firsthand for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
So again, kind of stupid tone of voice aside, that's why that's significant. He gets down to New Orleans, he comes on home and stays for 6 years and develops some love interests.
So yeah, in New Salem, he meets his first love, Anne Rutledge, who unfortunately dies at the age of 22 from an epidemic in that general area of typhoid fever. Lincoln was 26, and this sent him down a very, very dark path, considering his age. And isn't that when typically depression?
26, this is, when you throw out ages in terms of mental health and the development, these are very general numbers,
True.
right?
Very true.
But in the most general sense, with lots of exceptions and outliers, they say, I've been told, bipolar or depression or maybe mental illness in general tends to strike in your early 20s to mid 20s.
Valid. And this was a completely different time period in which, people came and they
They didn't
died.
have the DSM text revised, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
True.
I hope I said that right.
And that is irrelevant. Fact of the matter is, that's around the time when Abraham Lincoln started experiencing what they coined as melancholy, which is defined at the time as fear or sadness with no apparent cause. Now, that's a very loose definition, but that's the generalization of it. So he's in New Salem for what, 6 years?
Let me quickly interject. Melancholy. What do we call that now?
Oh, we call it depression. Clinical depression.
Clinical depression.
Right.
Continue.
Thank you. He stays in New Salem. He's a very well-known man in the area. He is known for wandering around, telling jokes, telling stories, reciting poems in the area. And as soon as Anne Rutledge passes, he really resigns from the town people, even the people he's closest to. And they notice, oh, wow, Abe's wandering into the woods alone with a gun for days at a time.
This is true?
This is scholars. They've researched encounters with...
I mean, what do you remember seeing him do is what I'm trying to say.
Oh, I saw him do the whole thing. I mean, he terrifying.
So no, but that's kind of, I didn't know that. So there's accounts of him just kind of disappearing into the woods with a gun.
Right, and he pulled away from his community entirely.
Withdrew. Withdrawal.
Oh, withdrew.
I'm kind of saying it, implying like
Yeah, he withdrew from his closest friends and
a reaction to losing a drug, right? His girl.
That
That
kind
kind of withdrawal.
Yeah, that kind of withdrawal.
Melancholy.
Melancholy, clinical depression.
So this is, again, around 1835. So in just keeping his age in mind.
26, first love, sad. just sad. She dies and disappears from his life. So
he's
it's
walking around. He's
extremely melancholy.
people are noticing and disturbed by this. You're saying
Extremely concerned about his health, not just in the time, but for his future mental health.
Okay.
So the entire community is terrified for Abe. And he's also even mentioning, I want to kill myself. I want to commit suicide. He's openly declaring this to people, letting them know I'm not okay. And this was actually, and we'll get to that, a recurring event throughout his entire life.
So he's espousing evidence of suicidal ideation.
Absolutely.
Is the term.
Blatantly.
The check marks they make you box. The check box they make you mark. Not
In
the
order
check
for
mark
your-
they make you box.
I didn't even notice you did that.
This is 200 or so years ago, but
This is typical
there's
depression.
Historical, stuff's
Yeah.
written down.
Right. So about a year later, after Anne Rutledge's 1836, he meets Mary Owens. He writes her a letter after they've, courted for some time?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not to jump in, but I think it bears mentioning, or it's worth mentioning, this was a tumultuous relationship. And in reading about this, it kind of spoke to me personally, though I won't get into the nitty-gritty of that at the moment. He's in his mid-20s. His previous girlfriend, Anne Rutledge, died a year before. Him and his new girlfriend, Mary Owens, they're fighting, all the time. They're
Right.
not getting along. And so, he writes her a letter, right?
Yeah, saying he wouldn't blame her if she ended the relationship and she never responded.
She just didn't respond.
I mean, is that really a blow?
Do you think on his letter, on his iPhone, it said read? Do you think he at least got a message received notification?
Right. No, on Facebook, it's recorded in books that his messenger said seen. Not sent, seen.
So he got closure then.
No.
Well, if he knew she saw it and she didn't respond.
Okay, no, that didn't happen. Facebook is very recent, if you guys didn't know that.
Wait, you were joking?
I was totally joking. Sorry.
You got me. I feel like a rube. Is that the right word? Isn't that what Hannibal Lecter calls Clarice, whatever.
Yeah.
Jodie Foster.
I think so.
Do you know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes?
You look like a rube.
You look like a rube. A well-scrubbed, hustling rube with a little taste.
Can we quote that for a while?
A census taker once tried to test me.
A census taker once tried to test me.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Go on. There needs to be an episode dedicated.
What if you sat down to dinner with Hannibal Lecter and you were like, Hanny, what'd you make tonight? And he's like, some liver, fava beans, and a nice Chianti. You want some?
I mean, do you know at the time that he's a cannibal?
I mean, his name rhymes with cannibal.
But do you really
So the
know?
thought,
that's his-
knowing my own brain, even knowing nothing about him, just hearing, hi, I'm Hannibal, I would have probably very quickly crossed my mind, I wonder if this guy's a cannibal.
So what is that liver? Is that
I would have
chicken liver?
dismissed it, though, until he went, I gotta go, bro.
That's the sign.
You use Evian skin cream.
I would have texted my BFF and be like, give me that call.
And sometimes you wear lead-on.
This date didn't turn out as expected.
So,
I would court him.
it's obvious we should probably devote more time to Hannibal Lecter in this Lincoln disordered personality section, but even though that makes more sense, we're going to bring it back to Lincoln.
And his engagement to Mary Todd.
Mary Todd. So I'm already confused, but so I'll remind our listeners, because I'm reminding myself. Mary Owens was the one who didn't respond to his letter. Mary Todd is number 3 from a wealthy slaveholding family. This didn't sit well with Lincoln, but they got engaged in 1840, and then in 1841 he kind of started to get indigestion from this not sitting well with him, and he broke off the engagement. And then in 1842, he ended up getting married to her anyway. And there's a funny little story. He was, apparently had a lot of anxiety at his wedding. And he was walking along on the day of his wedding, and his friend saw him and asked him where he was going. And he said, "To hell, I suppose."
Is that anxiety or absolute just dread? I don't want to marry this woman. I don't know who I am. That's what it screams at me is, I don't know who I am. Why would I want to marry this lady?
That's way too intelligent of it. You shouldn't have analyzed it so intelligently, because I just wanted to laugh at picturing Lincoln pulling his hair out. Like, but you're right. It was not knowing himself and knowing he didn't know himself, maybe.
And knowing that this is a terrible idea, but let's do it anyway. She's got the dress.
So they do get married. Mm-hmm. Mary Todd and Abe Lincoln, 1842. They had 3 sons. He was reportedly in a very affectionate father, quote, loved children. Truly a good guy, although he was also apparently quite busy. But when he was able to, he was there for his kids, his 3 sons, and I don't think we can fault him for focusing on business from time to time. Mm-hmm. Or that business might not have gotten done, and we might not be making this podcast right now. Civil War, I think, was the business he kind of was focusing on from time to time, you know what I mean?
But he made time for his sons. He loved his sons.
It wasn't that yet, but
right.
He was
valid.
beginning kind of moving towards a political career,
right?
If I'm not mistaken. But these 3 sons, they all died unnaturally young of disease before their time. This had a profound impact on both parents, on both Abe and Mary. And again, as your sister Margaret mentioned, melancholy. His melancholy got much worse. In fact, after Lincoln would later get assassinated, which I think most people know that, his wife, Mary, was herself committed to a mental health asylum for depression. Is that correct?
I read somewhere also she might have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, which could be an interesting episode in the future.
Right. So they, again, Mary Todd from a wealthy slaveholding family. Lincoln very much anti-slavery, but loves her clearly, despite himself and his own misgivings and hesitations, does go through with it, gets married, have 3 kids, love them, love each other, and after Lincoln dies, Mary loses it. So not to read too much into that or analyze it, but I think, again, an unusual, and I mean that in mostly a positive way, relationship. During his presidency, his wife Mary cooked for him, apparently was the only one who cooked for him. And this is interesting to me particularly because in being from a wealthy family, she did not cook a lot. So she was actually supposedly a kind of a crappy cook. But Abe had very simple tastes, so this worked out well. And just a fun little factoid, his main meal that he liked Mary to whip up, imported oysters.
Yo, I can't even do anything with oysters.
Well, oysters are an aphrodisiac.
Oh, okay, that's where you were going with that.
Mary.
How about those oysters tonight, babe?
Oysters.
With some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
So yeah, no, joking aside again, a very intimate, nuanced, individual relationship. Both of them, their minds, susceptible to more extreme emotions than the typical person might be familiar with.
Exactly, and to note on that and relatability to, even now, is that a codependent, potentially, but not in this case, destructive relationship, feeding off of each other's emotions. Because yes, his entire life, we'll just generalize it and say his entire life, he suffered and lived with depression.
One long depressive episode.
Exactly, just terribly long. The man loved poetry, the man loved reading, so he actually, I forget the year, 1840s, wrote a poem called The Suicide Soliloquy, and it was published in a local magazine. It was never certain that he was the one who wrote it, but there were accounts that he would recite it elsewhere. So
this is this accepted in academia as being true, or it's speculative?
It's speculative, for sure.
Is it speculative but more empirical than like a random blog article?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, again, we'll include the source in the info below the...
Right, if you'd like to read more about Lincoln.
Do you want to know more? Starship Troopers?
Is that... I don't remember. I can't
You haven't seen Starship Troopers?
I have, but I can't quote it.
Nothing makes me smile like the incomparable genius and acting chops of Casper Van Dien.
You know his name?
Yes, I know his name.
Why? What else
Johnny
is he in?
Rico.
I only have one rule. Everyone fights. No one quits. If you don't do your job, I'll kill you myself.
Is that what he said?
Hey, I
exactly?
need a co-host. The job is yours. Until you're dead or I find someone better.
Do you get me?
That's
Are
a
you going to
Starship.
fire me? Oh,
These are all Starship Troopers quotes.
stop quoting it because I think you're talking to me. I think you're saying things to me.
Welcome to the Roughnecks. Rico's Roughnecks!
1840s, but we're going to jump to 1860 at the Republican convention in Decatur, Illinois. Everyone's cheering for Lincoln. Everyone's like, yeah, Lincoln, get some.
We've got one of their brains now. Pretty soon we'll know how they think, and then we'll know how to beat them.
So,
These are direct quotes, I'm assuming?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I assume.
crowd roars for the man. And he's 51. Lincoln at this point is 51 years old.
Okay.
So he's lived quite some time with melancholy.
What mysteries will the brain bug reveal?
And a man in the crowd observing him on the convention floor afterwards said, quote, "I then thought him once one of the most diffident and worst plagued men I ever saw."
Federal scientists are working around the clock to probe its secrets.
The next day the convention closed. William J. Bross, the governor of Illinois at the time, saw Lincoln sitting down the hallway alone, and as he approached him, Lincoln said, "I'm not very well." Very open his entire life about how he felt and his illness and expressing it via poetry or, I mean, if he had a Twitter, it would just be blasting, "I'm sad, somebody help me." And everybody cared about him and everybody was worried, but what do you do about it at the time?
He didn't hide his emotions. I mean, I don't think he completely just melted down in public.
No.
But yeah, I myself as well read, especially when he was younger, he would cry in public sometimes.
Right. A lot of people voiced their concerns for him. But, I mean, it's not necessarily a cry for help. I mean, he took the time, obviously, to end slavery, which I think is something to distract himself from his melancholy. So taking all that energy or lack of energy and putting it towards his career and what mattered most to him, I mean, he probably did that his entire life and somehow found his own way to cope with it, cope with the symptoms. And I think that's impressive because, as we said at the time, it's not
the most, there wasn't a lot of efficacy in their modern medicine.
I believe we mentioned in the last episode, Beethoven was told to go chill out somewhere.
Come to terms with his condition.
Right, yep.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like imagining myself there in my head. You hear the story, like crying and melancholy and 6 foot whatever and lugging an axe, and despite all this bizarre behavior and disappearing into the woods with a gun and openly talking about suicide. And he was very well liked on top of all this. I mean, if someone did what he did now, it'd be hard not to be weirded out and creeped out by that person.
I'd say so.
And yet, I think you're allowed to kind of make the assumption that if he lived today, he would have been likable despite those things, you know? But
can I also note, on today's culture, then at the time it was sort of community. Let's all take care of the man with the broken arm and say, "Oh, you have a broken arm? Let me show you how much I care about you, and we need you to be okay because this is how we pull forward as a nation, as a community," right? We've kind of lost that. We lock these people with broken bones away, mental health away, and we don't necessarily lock them away, but these downtrodden individuals, they don't have a community saying, "Hey, I want to help you." I mean, I think it says a lot about peer support to note upon what we're...
CPSs,
that's...
Both of us. And again, this episode graciously sponsored by the Pennsylvania Peer Support Coalition. But here's my response to what you said, to which I agree. That is all true. And again, we talked about the nationalism, the patriotism, people pulling together a real sense of interconnectedness and identity as Americans. There was a general prevailing sense of goodwill and helpfulness and community, but not just any person could have done all of those negative things and still been liked.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I totally agree with what you said, and to me that's the environmental half that lifted Lincoln maybe, or kept him going at least. But there was clearly something going on that had only to do with his own head and the way he was or the way he interpreted his world and allowed it. He felt it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like he was...
And yeah, I think that's important.
He was in contact with tragedy.
Somebody actually at training for us said, don't wallow, allow your emotions. Allow yourself to experience them, but don't wallow in them. And I think that's what Lincoln tried or attempted and successfully
Yeah,
did.
he let it in.
Yeah.
And dealt with it. And it...
With coping skills, even.
I mean, Lincoln, from his own perspective, did not have an enjoyable life.
No.
Not even considering his assassination, but I mean, he was more or less, when left to himself, miserable all the time.
Right.
And would become his fatherly, almost superhuman, unifier, preserver of the Union, eloquent poet, Gettysburg Address. All the good, positive, more manic side of his bipolar came out in public, but in the majority of his time, when he wasn't in the public eye, very unhappy, melancholy. I think that's important.
No, I think it's definitely important. I don't know if, me personally, any mental illness resides on its own. I don't know if you can strictly experience depression and whatnot, but Abraham Lincoln definitely, you can't make a speech such as that without some sort of glorious mania, right? Something lifting you up.
And I think that's a good place to wrap up this exploration into Lincoln as our this week's disordered personality. But the Gettysburg Address, sort of the crowning linguistic, if you will, oratory achievement of Lincoln, what he's most known for saying, a very, relative to political speeches, short speech. And not to go through the whole thing, but as you recall, hopefully, if you've read it or heard it, towards the end, he says something about the better angels of our nature, which is, have you ever seen the movie American History X?
Yeah.
Which has to do with racism, so there's obvious parallels to Lincoln and the Civil War and stuff. The end of that movie, the character who's doing a voiceover says, someone once told me, if someone said it better than you have, just repeat what they said. And then that movie ends with the end of the Gettysburg Address.
So I guess this is where I tell you what I learned. My conclusion, right? Well, my conclusion is, hate is baggage. Life's too short to be pissed off all the time. It's just not worth it. Derek says it's always good to end a paper with a quote. He says someone else has already said it best, so if you can't top it, steal from them and go out strong. So I picked a guy I thought you'd like. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strength, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature.
That gave me chills just now, for sure. Can't explain why, but that is an excellent way to end our disordered personality of the week.
Yes, that the better angels of our nature, the things we are capable of, our inherent goodness in moments of crisis. Despite Lincoln's melancholy, clinical depression, that is the opposite side of his bipolar, and his diagnosis, bipolar, would have been today, as according to, clinical criteria.
When we come back, we're going to have our guest of the week, who is Nathan Bruni, who is diagnosed with clinical depression, and we will expound upon that upon our return.